Okay, just bear with me just a moment. I'm going to start the recording for us. Mhm. All right, we're ready. Here we go. Peace and blessings to you all. This is a new day for you, and I am Dr. Raul Richardson. And as promised, returning today are the very, very special guests we enjoyed last week. Attorney Wanda Cochran, my dear friend and sister, and my dear friend and sister, Ms. Theresa Bettis, Executive Director of the South Alabama Center for Fair Housing. And we really just got off to a remarkable start last week, and all of the demographic data, information, issues confronting our community were shared in last week's meeting. And etched forever into my mind indelibly was some of the data points that Ms. Bettis shared with us relative to understanding the very basic elements of operating in today's world as an adult, and that being be able to earn a living, find affordable housing, and what that looks like from a budgetary component. And Theresa shared with us that the most people intend that 30% of the money generated from their employment is going to be applicable towards paying their rent and utilities. And now for basically a one-bedroom apartment in this marketplace in Mobile, Alabama, we're looking at rents in the $1,000 a month range, which means that a person has to be making a wage that far exceeds what we know people are currently earning in this marketplace. So, ladies, thank you, thank you, thank you so much for joining us one more time again here on a new day for you now on Contentville. So I know that you two are thoroughbreds of the finest caliber, and I don't have to do a whole lot to get y'all out of the gate to get started on this conversation because it's near and dear to all of our hearts, our community interests, and we're extremely passionate and involved in so many levels on it. So where do we begin? Welcome back. Glad to see you both.
We're glad to be back with you this morning, Ro. Yeah, we're talking all things housing and everything that relates to that. And I'll do a little recap on some stats that I gave last week when we're talking about what's considered affordable housing. Thank you for the recap of the needing the HUD is looking at 30% of your disposable income for rent and utilities. And so right now, the latest stats show that in Mobile, a two-bedroom fair market rent price, HUD sets the fair market rental prices, is $986, right, for a two-bedroom. But in Mobile, the average price for a two-bedroom unit is $1,138.
Mm-hmm.
You would need to earn to be able to afford that two-bedroom, you would need to earn $18.96 an hour
Very good.
working full-time, or have an annual income of $39,440.
Mm.
If you work minimum wage, you would need to have 2.6 full-time jobs at minimum wage. So two jobs and a little over a half
That's
to be able to
remarkable.
afford that. And you would need to work a minimum of 91 hours a week
Okay.
Wow.
at $7. And I looked it up. Alabama's minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. That's so an employee can pay you that, and that's our minimum wage.
What's remarkable about that data point, Ms. Bettis, is if they're working 100 hours a week, and a week is only 168 hours, even if they were afforded an opportunity for 8 hours of rest a day, they'd be hard pressed to find a way to transport themselves to the work that they need to get to be able to function
Yes,
properly. I mean, the math,
yes.
how they say it? The math don't math.
The math doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where we find ourselves, and So it's been an issue. The other piece of that we started to touch on a little bit for me is that I'm finding that it's difficult for me to have conversations about affordable housing and not talk about wages and the need for people to be able to make livable wages. We have a Mobile is portions of Mobile is now going to be a part of this new congressional district,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Congressional District 2, right? So we got a
Mhm.
big election, lots of folks running for this particular position. Election for those our listeners, remember, election day for the primary is March the
March
5th.
5th. That's
I
right.
want to, I believe in the power of the vote. But I spent some time over the last week looking at the platforms of many of the candidates that are running. And you know what I haven't found? Housing.
Mhm.
No, which is why this is so
I
timely.
haven't found
Yeah.
housing. And what is so interesting is that my research shows that if you are at 30% or below the area median income, and for Mobile, that's 68,000. If you're at 30% or below of that amount of money, there's a deficit of 12,000 affordable rental units in our area.
A deficit.
A deficit. We are short that many units.
Wow.
And if you are at 50% of the area median income of 68,000, there's a deficit of over 7,000 units. And it's interesting to me that I can't find any real focus on the issue of housing. And there's a lot of talk about economic development and things that I see, but they go hand in hand. And when
Mhm.
you're talking about it, and I saw someone is championing the $15, raising the minimum wage to $15. I'm sorry, it needs to be 20 now. We needed $15 20 years ago.
Amen.
Minimum wage needs to be 20. If in Mobile, and we are a modest city, if you need to make almost $19 an hour in Mobile, we shouldn't be looking at $15 for minimum wage, right? The minimum should be 20
It's so
so that we
ironic.
can live. We can lift people. That's the only way to lift people out of poverty and be
Mhm.
able to afford decent, safe
Yes.
housing. Yeah.
And it's I'm not going to say it's ironic. It's interesting that no one has expressed that on their platform in terms of this upcoming election cycle. And of course, we can explore this within the context of what our expectations should be relative to the elected officials that are representing us municipally, locally, and what the administration is doing with when money's currently allocated. But the thing that strikes me about what you said is we're talking about, well, one, let's understand something. In 2020, in the spring, when the pandemic came upon us, it was not uncommon for people to be getting paid minimum wage and even
Right.
$9. But the independent
Right.
business owners and some of the other entities began to raise the salaries because they couldn't get people to come to work. Suddenly, a person that's making $7.50 an hour was an essential employee,
Yeah.
but you can't afford to pay them. But now you don't have anybody to run your business, clean your dishes, serve your restaurants, all the other kind of stuff. Now they're making 10, 12, up to $15 an hour, even at McDonald's.
Mhm.
So, clearly they're in a need for the business to survive. They had to have the employees, and the employees had to be paid, and all the other issues that you point out. And of course, we're not even considering the conversation relative to home ownership.
Mhm.
Okay, the ability to
Yes.
have the money, the finances, the down payment, the deposit, et cetera, to be able to do all of that. We're just talking about rental units. So um, I don't know what else to do other than agree. And I wish I had something more substantive to be able to say, but I'm concerned. And your closing comment, which of course was your closing, but your last stated point was, how do we lift people out of this? And without those considerations, it's impossible. Yet we find it easy to have conversations about public safety and youth violence, which of course are issues as well. But if in fact you could make an affordable wage and could find affordable housing, then there's less of a chance you're going to want to go hit my grandma when she's coming out of Publix or Walmart or Greer's or someplace and try to
And
snatch
I'm
her pocketbook.
And Wanda, I know you want to say something, but let me
Yeah, no, go
put a
ahead.
put a pin right there, Ro, because the whole thing with the youth violence. Okay, so what the other there's so many facets to that, and Wanda recommended a book called Reclaiming Your Community to
Yes.
me, and I've gotten it right, and so I'm reading. And so one of the profound things that I read just here in the beginning of the book is that you are not doing any favors by fixing a person and then sending them back to a broken community. That is profound. And
Mhm.
that also is true. And so when we're thinking about our kids, and not only that, there is such a need for attention to youth. And there's a whole factor with youth when you talk about housing and fair housing, because what we have to remind parents and children is, especially when you are in subsidized housing, but really any housing that's not your own, if you're renting, your kids can get in trouble with the law, and it cannot even happen on the property where you're renting, but it can lead to your eviction from that housing.
Mm.
And most people don't know that. So just the mere fact that a person resides in your subsidized housing, has now been charged with a felony, can have the entire family put out of that program
Mm.
and made homeless and nowhere to go. So that's important. I wanted to interject that. Go ahead, Wanda.
Yeah, to pick up on Teresa's question of, how do you uplift people? That is really the foundation of local government. The whole point of local government is to make life better. And that's what politics is in the greatest sense of the word, is what is it that will create a great community? And if there were a formula or a slogan, a video, this is not easy stuff, but that doesn't mean that solving the problem can't be done, and you can't have fun while you're doing it. It doesn't have to be heavy, but I find it really helpful when I talk to people about housing and community stuff, is to remind everybody that housing, if you don't have good housing for your citizens, it impacts everything. And I love your hub and spoke metaphor, because Mobile financially is dependent on the sales tax. Where do
Correct.
they get their sales tax from? We get our sales tax from grocery stores, Walmarts, retail. People who live in your community spend almost all their disposable income in your community. So if you're just a hard-nosed financial person, we have a financial imperative to get people living back in this city for economic reasons. Public health, stress, whether it's caused by external or internal, kills people.
Yes.
And we know that it's the basis of disease. And when people don't have stable and secure housing, and especially children, uh,
Yes.
they have poor academic performance. And we said, I think last program, there's 5,000 homeless kids in the Mobile County school system. There are all
Yes.
sorts of health related issues. When you talk about community, you can't have a cohesive community if there aren't people that have stable housing. If you're worried every day about getting put out or where your next rent payment's coming from, how are you ever going to care about what the city council is doing, how they're spending the money? There's just so much you've got limited bandwidth. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yes.
Housing can create environmentally sustainable communities, particularly if it's designed well in neighborhoods that are walkable and available to transit. Um, the then there's real estate. If you've got neighborhoods that are failing and the housing stock is going down, the real estate values are depressed. So it harms everybody in the community, not just the individual. So, the whole housing piece, sure, it's really about the individual and helping that person, but it is also about the community and uplifting the entire community, whether you personally have a problem in your life or not. But I think the most important thing for me, well, maybe not the most important, but something that strikes me is that human beings are creative. And human beings have this infinite capacity to imagine their futures and to come up with ideas. And that can't happen if they are caught in a subsistence situation. And all of the brain power as a community that we are losing because a huge swath of our population, and I know there are people who are very negative and they have assumptions about people that don't have money, but I grew up in a generation where just because you were poor didn't mean you were stupid.
Yes.
And, there are a lot of really smart people that, I mean, you can use all kind of metaphors, but the fact that you are poor and uneducated doesn't mean that you are stupid.
I'm so
And
glad you shared that though, Wanda, because it's often been stated that we are products of our environment. But your statement reflects the deeper truth, which is a lot of times people overcome the circumstances of their environment to become something more than people anticipated them to be. And to
those are our
circle,
heroes. Those are our
yes,
heroes.
yes. And to
You,
circle back to something that Theresa got out of the book that you shared with us last week was this idea of that data point you shared is the precise computation necessary for understanding recidivism rates in terms of people returning to prison. If in fact you don't provide a mechanism, fertile ground, a petri dish of some kind where that seed can get the nutrients and water and kind of nurturing that it needs, then it's almost certain to return. We know that for people that have any kind of addiction, alcohol or otherwise based, that you have to separate them from that environment for a period of
Yeah.
time to allow their brain essentially to do a control alt delete. But upon having received that treatment, if they return back to the same environment that precipitated the addictive behavior, they're going to go right back to it. So we've got to create. I know within the context of our organizational systems and communication, we talk about avoiding silos, but we're creating silos of poverty that are generational, that are now creating the pipeline to prison pathway for students that were traumatized by a parent that got involved with an activity they shouldn't have got involved with, and now they're incarcerated. And then the cycle just seems to continue because now they can't get a job when they get out, or they can't live here, they can't live there. There's just so much of it that if we could address the nature that represents our humanity to care for other people and make certain that they can have a livable wage and affordable housing. Now we're talking about the essence of community. And just to stop and put a pin in there and kick it back to you, Wanda, we've advocated over the last couple of years about this sales tax business. So if I'm making $1 million a year and this person's making $25,000 a year, and we both need a gallon of milk, I'm much more able to afford that gallon of milk. But my house that I live in, because I make $1 million a year, is going to be substantially more spectacular, for lack of a better word. And the person that's
Mhm.
renting is maybe on a less than subsistence existence. But the reality is, if in fact we addressed it relative to this property tax issue, which that in the 1901 Constitution may never be resolved, but we certainly have argued about that point about sales tax on groceries and how that doesn't seem fair to those of us that are in the greatest need.
well, I would suggest that you try and get some financial people on your show. We don't have a lot of dialogue about money, and because people think, oh, budgets that, but it's really not that hard to understand. Cities have to take in more money than they spend, right?
Yes.
And cities have a perpetual lifespan, right? Businesses come and go, but
Mm.
cities don't. Our politicians come and go, but the legal entity has permanent obligations. And there's a lot of takeoffs I can do on that, but I think the first sort of aha moment that I had in understanding city budgets was that 80 or 90% of our entire budget comes from the sales tax.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that means if you quit taxing groceries, we don't have any money. It's unbelievable. Now, there is a state organization, I guess it's state, there is an organization, PARCA, you may have heard of it.
I have, certainly.
They publish a report on municipal finance, and the last time I looked at it, there is only one city in the entire state that takes in more property tax than sales tax. And it's, I don't know if it's Homewood, but it's one of those little suburbs around
Birmingham.
Homewood.
Mhm.
And, you know, understand that property tax, I don't know, there's a constitutional limit on how much a city can raise property taxes. I don't know if we have bumped up against that limit or not.
Mm.
But, you know, our elected officials are always quick to impose a fee or raise the sales tax, but they never want to talk about the business license tax, which is a tax that's levied on the business rather than the consumer.
Mhm.
The whole culture of taxation is to put it on the individual. Now, they will say, oh, well, it all gets passed on to the consumer anyway, and that may be true. But at some point, a business has to make a decision about whether it can raise prices or whether they're going to have to reduce profit.
Well, I tell you, I don't know if either of you know this. Maybe you do. I don't know if we've ever discussed it, but I serve on the board for the Alabama Association of Regional Councils. And that really started with me serving on the board for the South Alabama Regional Planning Commission. And the reason I bring that up was because at our last annual meeting, they showed statistics on the amount of revenue coming into the state as a result of the sales tax. And of course, nowhere, and I guess my point is, you're right. The amount of money coming in is staggering. But I wonder what it would look like if we juxtapose it against the corporate sales tax or the licensing tax and got the businesses to pick up more of it. Now, of course, the idea historically has been encourage a business to come into your community so they can generate jobs and then give them massive tax abatements in terms of structure, construction, transportation, et cetera, so that it can be more attractive to them. But I mean, if we learned anything from the ThyssenKrupp debacle, the fact is, we promised them the world, we gave them all these tax abatements, and then less than 10 years later, they were gone and basically broke into two separate companies. And in the initial onset of that, my perspective and experience was that they invited a lot of people to work at that organization in that area. But a lot of those folks were outside contractors that were 1099 employees that came in for the work with their mobile homes, their trailers, just for the period of time. And then they hired people to work for them as subcontractors that never ended up becoming W-2 employees. And as a result, that money didn't stay in the community, notwithstanding how much money we gave them as tax abatements to even come into the community. So there's a lot of room. You're right. I've got to identify that. But let me hand it back to you with this. What should our expectation be, whether it's the U.S. Congressional District 2 that's coming up for the primary election on March 5th, or our municipal elected officials here within our region in terms of their requirement to balance a budget or come up with ways to achieve a better outcome for our community and the inhabitants, which in some cases may be the least of us? Is there some mechanism? Is there some expectation? Is there some speaking truth to power that we can actually, raise this conversation on?
Well, I don't think, I think it's important, for our, on the federal level, it's really important to have someone who is going to go to Washington and represent their constituents. I don't know. I mean, that is such a different animal than local politics. I mean, the federal government prints money, so they do things that nobody else can do. But locally, we can't print money. We have to get our money from people. And we need more people in this city. And we need them in the city. And this idea that there's going to be this perpetual annexation, chasing the latest Walmart or the latest, shopping development in order to bring in taxes, or even chasing federal grants. That is not my idea of sound financial management. And what I would be curious in the next election is to have a real honest disclosure about where we stand financially with the city. There's a lot of stuff that's not in the budget, and I won't take too much on this, but I just want to give you a little, idea of what I'm talking about. So you may have heard about unfunded pension liabilities.
Yes.
Municipal governments had pensions and they weren't funding them properly. And well, one of the greatest success stories in Mobile that nobody really understands or knows about, and this has been, and everyone from Mike Dow to Sam Jones to Mayor Stimson need to take credit for this. Our pension system for police and firemen in Mobile was really on the verge of going under. And they made a huge commitment to fix it. And they did fix it. And as I understand it now, that pension system is almost fully funded and they are tax qualified. Now that's a bunch of technical stuff, but it's something that we ought to be proud of. And it shows that when we are committed to something, we can. Now, let me tell you about another unfunded liability that we are not addressing because nobody wants to talk about it. Our unfunded maintenance obligations. When people talk about infrastructure, that's what we're talking about. When a road is built and the city accepts that road for maintenance, they have that obligation forever. None of that is reflected in the budget. Some years ago, I know the administration was saying, huge amount of infrastructure backlog, millions and millions of dollars. We have the CIP program, which is great, but it's really a drop in the bucket as to what is needed. And all those new roads they just took in with annexation, that is an unfunded obligation. There is no money set aside to pay for any of that. It will be passed on, but it's not required, right? The law, and it used to didn't be required for pensions, but there was a change in the law, and in the accounting, that unfunded liability had to be reflected in the books. But the unfunded maintenance obligations don't have to be budgeted. And so they are passed on from generation to generation. And I know that we're at least $30 million in debt already. And they just built a $30 million parking garage, and God only knows what they're going to do with the Civic Center. But we're talking real money. And where is that money coming from?
Wow, that's remarkable.
And we need real talk about this, not, the economic multiplier effect and this imaginary stuff. We need a return on investment calculation that is based in reality. And I can't believe that I talk about finance because it's just something I have never been interested in. But the more I guess I'm like Theresa, she had her aha moment about living wage. My aha moment is we are ignoring what we know builds a strong city, which is incremental development, fiscal responsibility, uplifting communities. And we are chasing top-down projects that have a lot of glitter and spice, and those have a cost. Like we got this bridge going across the bay that's going to be built. God only knows what that's going to cost. Who's going to clean up that bridge?
And ironically, because that was one of the big projects that SOPC undertook, was this idea that when that bridge first started, we were talking about several hundred million, maybe $1 billion. You realize now that those finance institutions that contract those engineering firms that are going to do that work, in order for them to return an investment on their investment financing this operation, those are going to be 55-year contracts, which means that if our grandchildren get the contract to paint the stripe down the road or put flowers on the walkway, they're going to have that contract for 55 years. And I want to kind of circle back, and we've only got probably about 20 minutes left, but I wanted to circle back to something that's germane to what both of you just expressed. One, the idea of having a budget and determining what the priorities were and then reflecting the commitment therein. And then, of course, which is a process which is not uncommon to business people, much less elected officials, is the financial business concept relative to what's called amortization. So we built a new house. All right. So that house may have a 30-year roof on it. It may have this, it may have that, whatever the conditions may be. But we know that we've got to put aside some money in the event that you have a hurricane, or if you have a boiler go out, or an equipment failure, something like that. And that unplanned expenditures that you described relative to the roads and things of that sort are something that we face in housing all the time. So you may have to paint, you may have to do maintenance, you may have to replace equipment, you may have to update equipment, you may have to replace windows or roofs, and all of those things are part of the management of that housing development. So I just want to state that you guys sparked that in my
Well, and
mind.
and I want to hear from Theresa on this, but I do want to say this. If you were to float that amortization concept to local government, they would say, well, we have a reserve fund.
Yeah.
And that's and they do. I think there's 50 something million dollars. But my question is, who authorized the creation of that reserve fund? How are the funds accessed? What is the purpose of the fund? Now, state law has certain mandatory, if you have $100 million budget, you have to hold back 10%. There's some, but that doesn't have anything to do with creating a fund that you draw on in times of need.
No, that's
That
more about
is,
credit worthiness and making sure that they stay financially viable so they can go and get more money,
but
funds, or
this
bonds.
reserve fund is, I don't see any legislative authority creating it. Now, it may be, well, you don't have to have it, but that's not the question. The question isn't what's legal, is shouldn't we have more accountability about these surplus monies, and where is the legislation? And I'm talking about local ordinances.
Mhm.
That this money is for this purpose, and in order to access it, you're going to have to do these things. And anyway, that's just a point about money, but I do want to hear from Theresa on the financial side too.
And particularly I am as well, because Theresa was intimately involved with this whole. I've heard a lot of these legislative folks, elected people running for office, et cetera, talk about the influx of cash that came in as a result of ARPA monies and this and that. And you know what? How those monies were allocated, whether they were used rightfully or wrongfully, there's not necessarily going to be another indication that we're going to get another influx of cash like that. And what does it mean when those monies come in and now you develop an expectation that's not sustainable? But Theresa, take it.
Yeah, so the opera funds, that's always a contingent piece for me, because it is as clear as mud to me as to what is happening with that money. Um, I just recently looked at the budget that was approved, and I tried to find the ARPA money in the budget. I don't see it. It's not clearly defined, which it should be, as a line item. The city got $58 million, but 29 million of it is allotted for the development of affordable housing. But I don't see that. I can't find it in the budget. So what is that all about? In the whole transparency piece, I recently attended this resiliency meeting that the city held. One of the things they talked about in this doing this resilient, and that's about as clear as mud as well. So I got to have some follow-up discussions about that, because one of the things that they pointed out in developing a resiliency plan is that the city wanted to be transparent. They wanted to really engage with the community, but I don't see that. You're writing that on a piece of paper as a plan that you want to do this. This is your goal. But when citizens are limited to 3 minutes to speak before the council. When you have committee meetings and citizens can't even interject or make comment based on things that are being said in a committee meeting. When data and information is gathered from the community and presented back to the city leadership and they thumb their nose at it, you know, I don't see the transparency. And you're right, Wanda, we should have a better understanding of what money is coming in, what money is going out, and you're right, if you got this surplus fund of money, how is that overseen? Housing is not a priority for this city leadership. It has not been. And from the past two administrations, I have talked with their housing and community development about the need for a real emergency shelter in the city of Mobile. Wanda, you made that every time I hear that number, it makes me sick to my stomach that we have 5,000 homeless children. If we
Yes.
don't have enough decency to care that our babies are housed in safe housing. And then you see all of the stuff that's happening in our school system, and you vilify the children when it's not their fault. It is the adults who are failing them, and they're failing our city, and they're failing our communities because we are not doing what needs to be done. And to me, it's I take a playback from Malcolm X. By any means necessary, we need to eliminate that number. There should not be one homeless child in our school system, let alone 5,000 in the largest school system in the state. And we don't address that issue. And it was brought to the attention years ago, even before the pandemic, and nothing has really happened. So when you think about the funds, and I'm looking at, I think it was last year or maybe the year before last, they built a new shelter for the dogs. I think it was like $3 million. And I'm like, wow, the dogs can
Wow.
get a shelter. We can't get
Wow.
a real shelter for human beings. Are you kidding me? This is just crazy.
That
And we
just blew
have
my
to,
mind. That just blew my
I mean,
mind for
but
real.
you have to, at some point, and you have to remove the red tape, right? I talked last time about we've had instances where people show up at our office on a Friday evening with their babies, and they have nowhere to go. And guess what? There's not nowhere I can send them. Housing First stops taking, intakes at 2 o'clock. And even if they do, they won't be housed, right? Family Haven is one of our really good shelters that houses families. They stay full. They stay out of room. So there has to be a real, my mama used to always say, where there's a will, there's a way. And
Yes.
I just kind of live by that. And I just feel like if you really cared and if it was on your priority, your list, we would find a way. America is one of the richest, the richest country in the world. And yet we have people living under bridges and living behind buildings and sleeping in their cars and being, evicted, it's horrible. And so, Wanda, we talked about, I would like for we run out of time and it may bleed into a third conversation, but,
And well, let's
we were
feel free
talking
to do
about,
that too, because I don't want
yeah,
to
yeah,
shut you guys
because,
down.
yeah, because what is some solutions, right? And we talked a little bit about there's some things that are not being done by leadership that could be done. One of the things, I shared is that I have the pleasure of being able to serve on the Africatown Redevelopment Corporation Board of Directors. And so I'm getting a real crash course and learning intimate knowledge about what it takes to build a house in Mobile. And when I found out and came to the realization that we had like an 8 month process, just, between getting the architecture designs, getting them approved by the city, and this permitting and that permitting and all. And I thought to myself, oh my God, 8 months? Oh, that is just ridiculous. So Wanda, will you we talked a little bit about that, and I said that, that tends to be a fair housing concern because when you talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing and you're receiving all of these federal dollars, And there's more money coming down the pipeline to the city for that. And then the county, there was just an announcement, the county's about to get $28 million, for affordable housing. And so there's more money coming down, but it's like, oh my gosh, if it is this hard, if it takes that long to get through the process and the cost is so astronomical, what how do we begin to address that? I think we need to talk about identifying some of the things that we see that are problematic in addressing the housing needs, and then what are some particular, kind of lead into that conversation, and we can go into a deeper one about how we begin to address that.
Yeah, I think that's a
give
good
me one
idea.
second.
Go
Give
ahead.
me one second, Wanda. Because there are people that are probably just tuning in and don't know what they've missed. You're listening to A New Day for You on Contentville. And joining us today are Theresa Bettis, Executive Director of South Alabama Center for Fair Housing, and attorney Wanda Cochran. And we're having a really wonderful conversation about housing, financing, et cetera. And given the fact we only have like 5 minutes left, and clearly we're going to have another conversation, I wanted to let Wanda go from the point you jumped off at, Theresa, but I want to end this conversation in the next 5 minutes with some things that we can say we have reasons to be hopeful. You kind of teased it a little bit, Theresa, by saying, what are some of the things that we should expect or we should be encouraging or expecting out of our elected leadership, budgeting, finance? We're not going to change the 1901 Constitution. We're probably not going to be able, in the time it takes to build a house, be able to do anything to resolve the property tax dilemma. But let's talk about that. Let's give people, one, a reason to come back next week and listen to us again, but two, not to crawl into some type of a fetal position and enter a
Feel like
dark
it's
space.
hopeless, right?
Right. What can we say to that end?
Well, it's a beautiful day.
Yes, it is.
I take a walk in the sunshine. Uh, it's just hard being human, To quote a famous old hippie, Wavy Gravy, he said, "We are all just bozos on the bus." Everybody has a different lens on the world, and we view the world differently. And it's easy to get into despair because you have a tendency to think that your way is the one right way. And there isn't a one right way. And I think people want to have a one right way. And if you want an efficient government and a simple government and a fast government, just have a dictator and you don't have nothing to worry about because it'll
I got
all
chills
be
with you saying
simplified
that
for
because we
you.
already got somebody offering to do that for us, but
Right.
that's another
But
conversation.
democracy is not a noun, it is a conversation. And I think the hopeful thing is what I see in the community is there is more and more conversation happening. We tend to think, well, we can't do this because government that. Well, there is so much we can do both to change the existing system, but just on our own. And I think for like the next time, we can talk about some of those things. But for now, I want to just tease Theresa's problem a little bit. Why does it take 8 months to pull a permit? And in the real estate development world, let's say you're an out-of-state developer and you want to come in and invest in a community and you want to do a project, it doesn't matter what it is. The first thing you want to know is whether the project you're proposing on that particular piece of real estate can be built by right or not. And what I mean is by right development, and this is a great oversimplification, is that you take your building plans, take it up to the counter, they review it, stamp it, and you're done. Anytime you introduce a discretionary process into the system, it slows it down. Whether it is a planning commission approval, whether it's any kind of conditional use, all of that. And that is a big obstacle to development because we have lots of conditional uses here. And so we are not alone. Cities all over the United States are dealing with the exact same problems we are. They may be a little different, but everybody's trying things. And so I've got some things we can talk about next time, just based on my, reading in the area. And it is hopeful, and particularly the young people. They're terrific.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And Theresa, I'm going to hand the mic back to you, but I'm going to apply with a little sloppy segue in the middle of this housing conversation as relates to unplanned expenses, because we know that looming on the horizon is another difficult conversation as it relates to water systems. Now, there's a lot of conversation going on about that in Pritchard, but we had that conversation in Flint, Michigan several years ago. Jackson, Mississippi, failing infrastructures, being able to continue to have that expense and be able to afford it and deliver a vital resource to human beings, which is water. So I don't want you to go into the water piece, but I want you to leave you got 2 minutes, Theresa, to kind of leave a positive thought that we can share and get people to come on back next week to talk to us again.
Well, I'm an eternal optimist and I believe in the resilience of people, right? My what I would encourage people to do, and I know there's a lot going on. There's a lot. But the power of the people is always greater than any leadership that we have. The community really is the leadership. We know that we have elected leaders, but take your own block, you know, and be a champion. There's an opportunity for you to champion for your own neighborhoods and your own communities. We have elected officials, and they're just that. They're elected. They're public servants, whether they realize that or not. And we pay their salary. And as such, we want good employees, right? We want good employees. And so, and if you see an employee that's not doing a good job, then you need to call them in and have a conversation. And I think
Yes.
just being more vocal about what we see in our community. And unfortunately, so many communities have been marginalized for so long that they think it's normal to not have. But I would encourage listeners that it's not normal and it doesn't have to be accepted. There's a ton of money coming down the pipeline for infrastructure that will include housing as well. It's going to include monies for our streets. The streets, I live in Pritchard, I can talk about it, and the streets are bad. But Mobile better watch out because I'm getting more potholes in Mobile, and I'm having a hard time distinguishing which city I'm in. So
Wow.
there's clearly a problem with failing infrastructure that needs to be addressed. But the good news is, under this current administration, there's a ton of money coming down, and we as the citizenry have to be engaged and say, hey, we want some of that money in our community to fix some of the things that we see there. So that's a good thing, because it's bad to have a need and you don't know how it can be fixed. But the city already has received a ton of money, the county has gotten money, and there's a ton of more money coming.
All right. Wow. Okay. I I'm just gonna look. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank
I
you.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to increase the size of the show because I feel like we are just now approaching some of the things that were the kind of the catalyst to get us to even have this conversation. And I want to leave our loyal listeners with this thought: as energetic, exciting, informative, perhaps entertaining and ultimately inspirational that this whole conversation may have been and will continue to be, I want folks to know that join us again next week on a new day for you here on Contentville at 10 a.m. Central Time, because we're going to have these fine individuals back to continue this conversation about what things we can do in our community. So with that being said, I'm going to put a pin in it right here. And you ladies just sit tight. Folks, don't you dare move. We'll be right back.